It is a Sunday, a little after 9. Your sister calls and asks whether you can drive her to the airport in the morning. The flight is early. She has asked before many times, and you have always said yes. Tonight you say that you cannot. There is a pause on the line. Then her voice cools not into anger, only down a few degrees. The way a room cools when a door has been left open somewhere else in the house. But something happens before the apology. In those 2 seconds, the relationship begins to show its terms. One person will punish the pause, another will make room for it. The difference will not be in their first disappointment, but in what they do next. Between her request and your answer, there is a space of perhaps 2 seconds. You have crossed that space 10,000 times without ever standing in it. Tonight, without deciding to, you remain there long enough to notice that it exists. Nothing dramatic has occurred. You did not accuse her, withdraw your care, or end the relationship. You simply failed to become convenient at the expected moment. Yet the temperature of the call changes so quickly that you can almost feel a hidden agreement being exposed, an agreement neither of you ever signed, and neither of you ever named. People call this people-pleasing. The word is too light. It suggests a habit, something you could correct with a firmer tone and a better morning routine. What is actually operating is closer to a contract terms, payments, penalties, and a clause about what happens to affection when the payments stop. I am not going to call this selfishness. Not yet. Hold that word somewhere. We will come back for it. For years you called it kindness. You anticipated what people needed, softened your refusals, and translated your preferences into something less demanding. You prevented tension before anyone admitted it existed, because others felt comfortable around you. You assumed you were creating love. Only later did you begin to wonder why that love became uncertain whenever you stopped managing their comfort. The first refusal rarely feels like freedom. It feels like evidence against your goodness. Your chest tightens while the other person becomes quiet, and the old explanation arrives immediately. You are being difficult. You have changed. You should have said yes, because saying yes would have cost less than this distance. Pleasing begins to look merciful again, even when the person receiving the mercy is never you. But stopping does more than change your behavior. It changes what you are able to see. The pause makes the hidden arrangement visible. That is where the truth begins to separate. While you were accommodating everyone, affection and relief often arrived together. People felt warmly toward you at the same moment that you removed an inconvenience from their lives. The two experiences became so closely joined that neither you nor they had to ask where appreciation ended and dependence on your compliance began. Some of them did love you. That is part of what makes the recognition difficult. Human affection is rarely pure enough to fit a clean verdict. A person can care for you and still prefer the version of you who asks for little. They can value your presence while resisting your separateness. Their love may be real and still organized around permissions you never knew you were granting. The painful discovery is not simply that people used you. That explanation is too easy, and it leaves your own part of the arrangement untouched. The deeper discovery is that being pleasing allowed you to stay close without ever testing whether closeness could survive disagreement. Compliance protected you from a question you were not ready to ask. Would they still move toward you if you stopped moving away from yourself? As long as you kept saying yes, the answer remained hidden. Every favor postponed it. Every swallowed preference protected the relationship from having to reveal its structure. You could interpret their warmth as acceptance because your difference had not fully entered the room. They were responding to you, but they were also responding to how little friction your presence created in their lives. What you called peace may have been a relationship in which only one person absorbed the conflict. The disagreement did not vanish. It moved into your jaw, your sleeplessness, your private irritation, and the fatigue that arrived before certain conversations. Everyone else experienced harmony because you were carrying the part of reality that would have disturbed it. Your pleasantness was doing invisible labor, and invisible labor is the only kind that never appears in anyone's accounting. You watched yourself do it without recognizing it as work. In the middle of a sentence, you would begin saying what you actually needed, then remove the last 4 words and replace them with something softer. The other person relaxed. You felt a small relief you never examined, because examining it would have required asking what you had just traded. Even now, the trade has its own muscle memory. Your fingers hover above a message an hour after the call ended. You have typed an explanation about the early meeting, the bad sleep, the week that has been difficult, and you can feel exactly how those words would return the warmth to room temperature. The temptation is not weakness, it is memory. Your entire relational history taught you that distance ends the moment you become easier again. Yet every unnecessary explanation obscures what the moment is trying to show you. If your simple no must be wrapped in enough reassurance to become emotionally harmless, then the other person is not encountering your limit at all. They are encountering a carefully altered version of it, one that has already had the inconvenience removed. The peace holds only because you protected it. Again, from the full existence of another will. Jung gave a name to the face a person constructs for the outer world. He called it the persona. In Time's 2 essays on analytical psychology, he described it as a compromise between the individual and society concerning what a person should appear to be. He did not treat this compromise as a lie. Society requires recognizable faces, and the psyche needs some protection from constant exposure. The persona is an achievement before it becomes a prison. The prison forms when the role becomes so convincing that the person performing it forgets what has been excluded. In your case, the acceptable face may have been endlessly receptive. Beneath it lived irritation, preference, limits, and the forbidden wish to be loved without first making yourself easy to love. Those excluded reactions do not disappear because goodness disapproves of them. They wait. They enter through exhaustion, delayed replies, sudden bluntness, or the strange relief that arrives when a plan is cancelled. You judge these moments as failures of character. They may instead be the return of information your pleasing identity was never permitted to carry. Anger is often the first signal, but it is not always anger at the person in front of you. Some of it belongs to the years in which you offered agreement before checking whether the agreement was true. Some belongs to the recognition that you helped teach people which version of you would always arrive. Their expectation did not form in isolation. Your fear of disappointing them participated in building it. That recognition is not blame. You were not designing your own erasure. You were preserving attachment in the most reliable way available to you. And each time tension appeared, compliance brought the warmth back. The role continued because it worked. You can hear how it was built most clearly at the family table, in the chair you have sat in since you were 7, with the same water glass at the same right-hand corner. Someone makes a remark designed to return you to your position. Nothing openly hostile, nothing anyone will remember tomorrow. Just a sentence so ordinary that no one else at the table notices it was said. The patient one would have smiled. The mature one would have understood. The undemanding one would have let the sentence pass through her without resistance. You feel the three of them stand up inside you, ready as always. But for the first time you hear it as a sentence rather than as the truth. Your voice does not rise. Your face does not change. Nothing at the table is disturbed. Something in you has simply stopped receiving the instruction as though it came from reality itself. You look at the water glass and you say nothing, and the meal continues, and no one will ever know that this was the loudest evening of your life. There is a way to see the difference, but it requires watching something most people ignore. Weeks pass. Then a message arrives from someone who has been silent, and it is warm, genuinely warm, warmer than you expected. They ask how you have been. They mention something you told them a long time ago and remembered wrongly. But they remembered. Old gladness rises in you before you have finished reading. Then, before the warmth has fully reached you, a second message appears. There is a request inside it. The question about your life was the doorway, the request was the room, and the moment the request is answered or the moment it becomes clear, it will not be the warmth withdraws. Not rudely, it simply cools on schedule, the way it always did. If you watch the timing rather than the temperature, you will see it warmth that arrives in front of a need and leaves behind it is warmth attached to the need. That is the instrument, not their tone, not their disappointment, not whether they were kind about it. The sequence, hold it carefully, though, because it is not a verdict machine. Loving people sometimes walk through doorways too. Tired people ask badly. A single sequence proves very little. What proves something is the same sequence. 12 times, over 2 years, with no other kind of visit in between. We will return to this. First, you need to know why you were the person standing on the other side of that door. Long before you understood compliance as a pattern, you noticed which version of you received the easiest welcome. The patient one was praised. The undemanding one caused relief. The child who understood every circumstance was called mature. And being called mature at 9 years old is not a compliment. It is a job offer. Approval gathered around the qualities that made your presence require less adjustment from everyone else. No one had to tell you directly that your needs were unacceptable. The lesson arrived more quietly. A tired expression when you asked for something. A change in tone when you disagreed. Warmth returning the instant you withdrew the request. Through repetition, you learned that connection ran smoother when your inner life stayed out of its way. Perhaps the people around you were overwhelmed, limited, or preoccupied with struggles they could barely name. Their inability to receive your full experience may not have been deliberate. The effect remained. You became skilled at sensing what a relationship could tolerate, then shaping your expression so precisely that your needs never exceeded its emotional capacity. Empathy grew up beside this adaptation, and the two became difficult to separate. You could see why another person had no room for you. You noticed their fatigue, their worry, the pressure they carried home. Because the explanation was visible, the deprivation became harder to protest. Their limitation made sense. So your disappearance began to feel compassionate rather than costly. This is where empathy divides against the person who possesses it. The ability to understand another mind is real and valuable. The difficulty begins when that understanding is used to overrule every signal coming from your own experience. Compassion becomes a court in which everyone else receives context, and your hurt appears without a defense. You learn to mistake needing less for loving more. It also made relationships more predictable, which mattered more than you admitted. If you did not ask, you could not be refused. If you adjusted first, no conflict could expose how little flexibility the other person actually possessed. You could not control whether someone was capable of mutual care, but you could control how difficult you were to care for. You became useful, agreeable, and emotionally inexpensive. When warmth arrived, you never had to face the possibility that it might vanish in response to the unedited person. A preference grows by being noticed, expressed, and allowed to matter. Yours was usually interrupted at the first stage, before you could ask what you wanted. Your attention had already moved toward what would keep the atmosphere calm. Desire was translated into consequence. What do I want times became times what will happen to everyone else if I choose it. The answer arrived through your shoulders lifting, your throat narrowing, or a heaviness that appeared before speaking. Something had already decided before you could deliberate. This is the 2 seconds again, but you were never inside them. They belong to something older than your judgment. In his early word association experiments, Jung watched people hesitate, stumble, or fall silent around emotionally charged themes. He called the structures behind these interruptions feeling-toned complexes, clusters of memory and emotion capable of overriding conscious intention. A complex does not wait for a considered decision. It can alter speech, posture, and reaction before the conscious mind understands what has been touched. Your reaction on the phone was never a simple choice between yes and no. Your body was calculating how much emotional disturbance your answer might create, and the calculation was being run by a structure assembled before you had language for choice. A simple preference carried the imagined weight of someone else's hurt, anger, or withdrawal, and it carried it faster than thought. After enough repetition, other people's comfort became evidence of your character. If everyone was content, you were good. If someone became disappointed, you searched for the failure inside yourself. Their emotional state served as a moral verdict. Even when their disappointment came from being denied something they were never entitled to receive. Such a system makes separation feel like cruelty. The moment another person suffers because you stopped accommodating them, you experience their pain as proof that accommodation should resume. You do not ask whether the expectation was fair. You ask how quickly you can remove the discomfort. But guilt is not always a reliable confession. Sometimes it is only the emotional residue of disobeying an old role. It reports that something familiar has been violated, not that something wrong has occurred. The intensity can be entirely real while the accusation is false. Your chest can feel condemned when your refusal was honest and proportionate and small. This was the hidden payment inside, pleasing everyone. You gave up the uncertainty of being known in exchange for the reliability of being approved. Approval could be produced. You knew the gestures, the tone, the quick agreement, the careful disappearance of your own claim. Being known could not be produced, because the real person might disappoint someone and would then have to discover whether closeness survived it. Once you stop performing the exchange, you lose that production line. You cannot make another person respond generously to your limit. You cannot guarantee that affection remains. When usefulness is withdrawn, pleasing was painful, but it handed you an instrument with which to influence whether people stayed close. Think of the friend who only writes to you in the evening, always after 8. Always, when something has gone wrong in their day. Never on a Tuesday afternoon, when nothing is happening. For years you were proud that they came to you. You interpreted the timing as trust. Now the timing has begun to look like a schedule, and you are not sure whether noticing that makes you perceptive or bitter. When was the last time this person came toward you without bringing a need? Here is the part I should say plainly, because it would be dishonest to leave it out. Stopping the bargain does not immediately create the closeness you wanted. It removes the method you were using to imitate security, and it removes it first, before anything replaces it. You lose the reassurance of being indispensable before you discover whether you can be valued without constant usefulness. The space between those two experiences can feel emptier than the old arrangement, and it can last longer than anyone promises you. It will. Nothing in this hour can shorten it for you. I can only tell you what it is, so that you do not mistake the emptiness for evidence that you were wrong. In that space, you want to become useful again, simply to feel recognizable. A request arrives, and the familiar role offers instant direction. You know who to be, what to say, how to restore the old ease. Refusing leaves you alone with your own unstructured life, and that life can feel strangely quiet, because so much of it was organized around responding to other people's urgency. Pleasing did not only protect relationships, it protected you from the uncertainty of preference. If everyone else's needs supplied your direction, you rarely had to discover what your own life required. Their urgency gave you purpose. Their relief confirmed your value. This is the shadow beneath endless accommodation. Part of you resented being needed, and another part depended on being needed to make your place unquestionable. Being necessary spared you from wondering whether you would be chosen while offering nothing. The role took from you, but it also protected you from the exposure of being present without a service to justify your presence. That truth does not excuse what others demanded, and it does not make their withdrawal harmless. It explains why the arrangement stayed stable even while it hurt. They received ease, attention, and access. You received belonging, identity, and protection from direct rejection. The exchange was unequal, and it still contained enough reward on both sides to keep either party from naming its terms. Now the old rewards are less persuasive. Approval still brings relief, but the relief no longer erases the resentment underneath it. Being needed still creates purpose, but purpose no longer compensates for being unknown. The agreement may still function socially, yet something in you has stopped believing that compliance and love are the same experience. At first, every change appears to confirm the worst thing you suspected. Someone calls less often, a familiar invitation does not arrive. A person who once praised your kindness becomes strangely formal, and formality between people who were close is its own kind of chill. You notice the distance and wonder whether your emerging limits have made you impossible to love. What is happening is more complicated than rejection. Some people are waiting for the familiar pattern to resume. Others genuinely do not know how to approach a person whose preferences they never had to consider. A few are respecting a distance they believe you requested. Not every silence carries the same meaning. Even when your fear translates all silence into abandonment, you may be tempted to test them. You stop initiating contact to see who notices. You withhold help and wait quietly for proof that someone cares about you apart from what you provide. When no one responds as you hoped, the pain seems conclusive, yet a hidden test reproduces the original problem. Exactly your need stays unspoken, while the relationship is convicted for failing to read it. Did you tell them you needed to be found, or did you disappear and wait for them to know? For years you were expected to perceive what others could not say. It is understandable that some part of you now wants them to demonstrate love the same way, to notice the change in your tone, sense the exhaustion under your silence, and offer care without being asked. Their failure to do so can feel like confirmation that they never saw you. Sometimes that conclusion is accurate. Some relationships contain very little interest in your interior life, but sometimes the other person does not know that your withdrawal contains a request to be found. They see distance and assume you wanted it. The painful truth is that being known requires forms of expression that pleasing allowed you to avoid entirely. Compliance made your communication deceptively clear. Everyone knew what you would offer, because the answer was usually yes. Now your inner experience contains reluctance, desire, affection, anger, and uncertainty at the same time. The task is no longer to produce the answer that preserves harmony. It is to stay honest while several conflicting feelings are still in the room. You are back at the family table. It is a different meal. Months later, and the water glass is where it always is. The same kind of remark arrives, dressed a little differently. This time you do not let it pass through you, and you do not fight it either. You put down your fork and you say, evenly, that you would rather not be described that way. 6 words, nothing more. The table cools. Someone changes the subject too quickly. Your sister looks at her plate. You sit inside a discomfort you spent 30 years preventing, and you discover that it is survivable, unpleasant, ordinary, and survivable. Later, you will replay it and find nothing cruel in what you said, which will not stop you from feeling as though you committed something. This is what the 2 seconds are for. They were never empty. They were the only place where the answer could have become yours. And for most of your life, something else occupied them before you arrived. Now the space stays open, and you have to stand in it without knowing what you will find. The delay frustrates people who are accustomed to instant reassurance. It also reveals how rarely your agreement was ever given time to become a real choice. Without the pause, kindness could not tell you whether it was freely offered. It arrived too quickly to contain consent. Now even a sincere yes may have to pass through resistance first, because you need to know whether the giving belongs to affection, fear, abi, or the wish to avoid another person's disappointment. After years of saying yes too easily, no can begin to feel cleaner than uncertainty. Refusal protects you from being absorbed, and its firmness produces a relief you have rarely known. For a while you may mistake that relief for proof that distance is always more truthful than accommodation. Yet, refusal can become another automatic identity. The pleasing person was governed by the fear of disappointing others. The unreachable person may be governed by exactly the same fear, only the strategy has changed. Instead of securing love through agreement, you prevent disappointment by denying anyone enough access to ask something of you. Once you see that some people preferred your compliance, you may begin treating every need as attempted control and every disappointment as evidence of conditional love. Suspicion promises to protect the self that pleasing abandoned. But if every request becomes a threat, other people are still determining your behavior. Opposition has replaced obedience without producing freedom. Jung called the long movement toward a less divided life individuation. It is not the replacement of one mask with a harder one, and it is not the triumph of a repressed side over the side that ruled before. It is the slow work of holding opposites without allowing either to seize the whole personality. Wholeness, in this sense, is not purity, it is capacity. Anger carries information, but it also carries accumulated time. A minor request can awaken the force of every request you accepted unwillingly. The person in front of you receives a reaction shaped partly by people who came before them. This does not make the anger invalid. It means the returning emotion needs responsibility as well as permission. You will find this out in a small way, probably over something trivial. Someone asks whether you can pick something up on your way, and sharpness enters your voice before you understand its size. It is not a large sentence. It is simply sharper than the situation deserved. Their face registers surprise, and shame arrives before they have finished registering it. Then the old identity seizes the moment and tells you that boundaries have made you cruel, that your previous silence was kinder, that everyone was better off before. But buried resentment and deliberate refusal are not the same thing. One erupts after self-abandonment. The other speaks before resentment has to accumulate. Learning that difference removes the innocence of both extremes. You cannot pretend that endless pleasing was pure goodness. You also cannot assume that every harsh reaction is justified because you accommodated for too long. The pain you carried deserves recognition. It does not grant every returning emotion authority over how another person is treated. This is where the separation becomes morally complex. You are trying to stop abandoning yourself without using self-protection to abandon everyone else. You are learning that another person can be disappointed without being oppressive, and that you can feel pressured without being powerless. The old arrangement erased your will. A harder arrangement could erase theirs. Some people will make the distinction difficult. They use your anger to dismiss the limit beneath it. If your voice tightens, they discuss only your tone. If your explanation is imperfect, they treat the imperfection as evidence that the request itself was unreasonable. You begin to believe that your boundary must be delivered flawlessly before it is permitted to count. A limit does not become unreal because it emerged awkwardly. Years of suppressed refusal do not always return in graceful language. You may need to acknowledge unnecessary sharpness while leaving the answer unchanged. An apology for how something was said does not require an apology for having a separate need. In the old system, apology meant restoration. You admitted fault, softened the truth, and returned access. Now you can say that you regret causing pain while refusing to remove the condition that caused it. Your mouth speaks care, and the old rescue does not follow. And guilt intensifies precisely because the familiar ritual stays incomplete. Another person may cry, become distant, or remind you of everything they have done for you. Their pain can be sincere, even while it also functions as pressure. You do not have to decide that the emotion is false in order to remain separate from its demand. Someone can be genuinely hurt by your change without possessing the right to reverse it. This is one of the hardest things an empath has to carry. You can understand another person's pain and still allow them to feel it, not because their suffering is unimportant, but because removing every painful feeling has required you to erase information the relationship needed in order to be real. Their disappointment may be the first honest consequence your compliance no longer absorbs. Allowing that consequence can feel like causing harm. Your stomach contracts when they go quiet, and every learned response urges you to repair the atmosphere. Yet repair is not always the same as restoring the previous arrangement. Sometimes repair begins when both people stay present while neither receives the outcome they wanted. Learning to stay present begins in unremarkable moments. Someone asks for help on a weekday afternoon, and you notice that the answer is not immediately available. Instead of offering yourself before the question has fully landed, you let the silence stand. You can hear the room. Their face changes slightly. Your breath goes shallow, and you count without meaning to count. And the pause is no longer being filled with an agreement you did not choose. 2 seconds, that is all it is. Yet it may be the first territory you have ever occupied. That pause alters a relationship more than a dramatic confrontation would. It removes the certainty that your time, attention, and understanding are already available. The other person must now meet someone whose answer has not been decided by their need. Some will experience this as distance, because immediate access had always felt like closeness. Some will also try to shorten it. They explain why the request matters, remind you how rarely they ask, or speak as though your hesitation has already injured them. Their words may sound entirely reasonable. What becomes visible is how quickly your uncertainty gets converted into something you are required to defend. One person presses for an answer. Another lets the silence remain. The difference tells you how much room your inner life is given. You may still say yes. The difference is that the agreement no longer functions as proof of goodness. It becomes a particular choice made under particular conditions, and you can feel whether the giving leaves warmth behind or quietly removes you from yourself. The answer alone does not reveal the pattern. The inner cost of producing it does. At other times, you will say no and watch a familiar expression disappear. Someone who called you generous will describe you as selfish. Someone who admired your understanding will say, You have become cold. The words enter deeply because they are written in the language of the identity you spent decades maintaining. They may sincerely believe what they are saying. From inside the old arrangement, your change looks like withdrawal. They experienced your constant accommodation as your natural character rather than as effort. So when the effort stops, they do not see a person becoming more honest. They see care being removed from a relationship that once seemed to contain an unlimited supply of it. You do not have to persuade them otherwise. Explanation may help some relationships, but it cannot force anyone to accept the loss of a privilege. You can describe your exhaustion perfectly and still meet resistance, because understanding your reason would require them to reconsider what they had been receiving without question. Their resistance awakens the impulse to produce evidence. You list everything you have done, every request you accepted, every moment you stayed silent. But the fact that you consented before does not obligate you to consent again. Your present limit does not require a documented history of suffering in order to be legitimate. Certain people will slowly adjust. Their first reaction may be disappointment, and then they come back with curiosity. They begin asking instead of assuming. They notice when you are quiet without demanding immediate reassurance. The relationship becomes less smooth for a while and more real, because affection is no longer being protected from the existence of two separate wills. This can feel less intimate at first. The old closeness depended on anticipation. You sensed what they needed before they spoke, and they rarely had to risk asking. Now both people have to use words, hear limits, and tolerate answers they did not design. The relationship loses some of its effortless quality because what seemed effortless was largely your effort. Other relationships will not adjust, and now you have the instrument for seeing it. The friend who writes only in the evening writes again. It is warm. They ask how you have been. And this time you watch the sequence rather than the temperature. The question, then the doorway, then the room. When you say that you cannot help this week, the reply is brief and pleasant and final. And you do not hear from them again until something else goes wrong. Once is nothing, twice is a coincidence. What speaks is the year in which no message ever arrived that was not standing in front of a request. What happens on the evenings when you have nothing useful to give? Across time, repetition says what no single reaction could prove. Their attachment was strongest when your function remained intact. Even then, the truth may not be that they felt nothing for you. They may miss your company and still be unable to relate to you beyond what you provided. They may carry tenderness, memory, and dependence together in the same hand. Human feeling can be genuine without being mature enough to include your freedom. Love can exist inside a structure that cannot tolerate equality. This recognition removes the comfort of simple anger. It would be easier if everyone who resisted your limits had been deliberately deceptive, because then grief could harden into judgment, and judgment could protect you from longing. Instead, you may see that some people cared for you as far as their capacity allowed and no further. Their capacity explains the limitation. It does not change what living inside that limitation required from you. You can understand why someone needed constant reassurance while admitting that supplying it consumed your peace. You can recognize their fear of losing closeness without agreeing that closeness must be secured through your obedience. The cost becomes visible in groups as well. When you stop smoothing every tension, other people are forced to experience one another directly. Someone has to carry their own discomfort. A disagreement stays unresolved longer. The atmosphere becomes less pleasant, and the person who used to manage it is blamed for a discomfort that was always present. You will hear that everyone has to be careful around you now. What that often means is that they have begun considering your experience before speaking. Consideration feels like restriction only when unlimited flexibility was treated as normal. What is new for them is not your sensitivity. It is the loss of freedom from having to notice it. Not every criticism is resistance, though someone may tell you that your refusals have become sharp, or that your silences leave them uncertain where they stand. The fact that the old role was costly does not make every new reaction complete. You can listen without surrendering. You can examine your manner without placing your existence back on trial. This is one of the quiet capacities emerging underneath the separation. Feedback no longer has to become a command. Another person can describe their experience, and you can consider what belongs to you without absorbing everything they feel. Their hurt may influence the conversation without deciding the verdict. You are at the family table for the third time. It is a year later. The chair is the same. The water glass is in the same right-hand corner. And the remark does not come. Perhaps someone learned. Perhaps the room simply reorganized itself around a person who no longer volunteers. The conversation moves without you managing it. And you notice, with something that is not quite triumph, that you are eating your meal while it is still warm for the first time in your adult life, because you are not watching everyone's face to see who needs something. Nobody at the table knows anything has changed. That is what a real change looks like from the outside. Almost nothing. Guilt also changes when it is allowed to remain. At first it fills the entire inner field. Your stomach contracts, sleep becomes restless, and the urge to send one more message grows stronger by the hour. But when the old repair does not occur, guilt eventually separates into the different feelings that compliance had kept fused together. Some of it is sorrow, because someone you love is disappointed. Some is fear that the distance will become permanent. Some may be genuine regret for having spoken carelessly. Once these become distinct, they stop issuing one identical instruction. Not every discomfort is asking you to abandon the limit. Grief becomes more precise too. You grieve the people who withdraw, and you may grieve more deeply when someone stays and reveals how little they knew about you. They ask what you would prefer, and you cannot answer. Their willingness exposes how long your own desires went unpracticed. Mutuality has appeared, and the self invited into it is still finding language. Preference begins with unimpressive things. Which conversation you have energy for, whether you want company or quiet, what kind of help you can give without resentment afterward. These decisions announce no transformed identity. They simply allow an ordinary week to contain information that used to vanish beneath everyone else's urgency. Receiving care may stay uncomfortable for a long time. When someone offers help without requiring usefulness in return, you look for the hidden debt. You begin repaying before the kindness has fully reached you. Yet occasionally, the transaction does not appear at all. The person contributes because connection includes their effort too, and you are left with the unfamiliar exposure of simply being cared for. with nothing to settle. This reveals the difference between being needed and being known. Being needed gave you a clear position and a reliable value. Being known requires you to stay present, while another person responds to needs you did not disguise. You cannot earn the response in advance or control what it turns out to mean. You can only watch whether care moves in both directions when nobody is performing indispensability. Relationships capable of that movement often become quieter. There is less emergency, less guessing, less proof offered through sacrifice. The absence of intensity can initially resemble a loss of feeling, yet the quieter bond asks more from both people. It asks them to say what they need, risk refusal, and stay connected when neither person is the other's solution. You may still miss the immediacy of the old role. Being the person everyone relied on made your value visible from a distance. Mutual affection is less dramatic and produces less praise. It shows up as someone remembering your limit, accepting a delayed answer, or staying warm on an evening when you have nothing useful to offer. Gradually, these small encounters change what the word love means in your experience. Love is no longer measured by how much you can endure for another person. It becomes visible in how much reality the relationship can contain your no, their disappointment, your care, their separate needs, and the uncertainty of what happens next, all present at once, without anyone disappearing. Some bonds become stronger under that weight, others stay distant, a few end without a final argument, simply because the function that kept them running is no longer being performed. You may never receive confirmation of what those people felt or why they left, and the absence of certainty is part of what you can now carry without turning it into an investigation. I said I would not call this selfishness. I still won't, and now I can tell you why. Selfishness would mean you took something that belonged to someone else. What you took back was your own 2 seconds. You did not stop loving anyone. You stopped being the only person in the room who paid for the peace. The word people reach for when a giver becomes ordinary is almost always the wrong word, but it is the word that arrives fastest. And for most of your life you believed the fastest word. You do not have to decide that everyone who left loved only what you provided. That verdict would preserve your anger, and it would also destroy the complexity you have worked to recover. Some loved you incompletely. Some confused your giving with your nature. Some lacked the capacity to change. Their limitations matter without becoming the entire meaning of your life with them. Nor do you have to dismiss the devotion you once offered. Your kindness was not meaningless because fear sometimes accompanied it. Your empathy was not false because it became entangled with the need for approval. Those qualities are still yours. They simply no longer appear on command. What was once compulsory can become a choice, and choice is what gives generosity back its honesty. The people who remain may still prefer your easier version on difficult days. You may still be tempted to become that person when a silence lasts too long. Nothing is settled permanently. The difference is that discomfort can now exist without automatically becoming evidence that you must go back. You can miss someone and refuse the arrangement that kept them close. You can feel guilty and leave the answer unchanged. You can recognize another person's pain without appointing yourself its remedy. Separation no longer requires certainty that they were wrong. It requires only enough honesty to stop making your disappearance the condition of everyone else's comfort. It is another Sunday, a little after 9, and the phone is ringing. The 2 seconds open again. This time you are standing in them when they do, and whatever answer comes may feel, for once, less borrowed from anyone else. Love remained possible. Compliance simply stopped speaking for it.
Hello, I'm John, and I manage the Psychoanalysis. Many of you come here seeking language for experience you have carried quietly for years. So I want to be transparent about how this film was made. This is an original essay inspired by Jungian psychology. AI-assisted tools support parts of the narration and visual production, while I personally review and edit every element. This is not archival footage or a lecture by Carl Jung. It is a contemporary interpretation offered for reflection, not therapy or medical advice. Thank you for trusting this space and for being here.